Alexander of Macedon. Afterword. Alexandros of Macedon had died unexpectedly there in the place of Nebuchadnezzar over a grey Euphrates, probably of malaria. Any spearman of his army might have survived such an attack. But Alexandros had worn out his body and his mind as well in those last years. Probably his death was due more to physical exhaustion and wounds than to the fever. Yeah, it could have had an infection from a wound. That's very common. But anybody of any strength, who knows, everybody around you could not be hit too hard by some disease, but and catch it. But someone with a stronger immune system, that particular disease kills him. He died still young, with his dream dominion only half completed. Would he ever have completed it? Some modern authorities hold that the task to which he had set himself was hopeless, and Alexandros Megas himself, fortunate in that he did not survive to share in its collapse. There is no way of knowing the truth of that. Now, there's always more work to do. And to some degree, one's got to let go, stop your clinging. Yeah, you're figuring out more to do, but it's not like, oh, my life's a failure. So one of the theories, one of the beliefs people have that gives them faith in reincarnation, it doesn't quite pan out. If you can reason out this sort of thinking to think that there's more reason to not believe in reincarnation, is that people reincarnate because they want to do, they have other tasks that they wanted to do in life, and therefore, but just like in one life, you don't just, wish fulfillment doesn't quite work like that. So therefore, it can create a drag in your afterlife. If there's an afterlife, that would make sense, but that you're just going to reincarnate because have unfinished work. You're always going to have that sort of thing's going to feed on itself over and over and over and over again. Why would it ever stop if you're allowed to come back once? We don't know that what he did, as Faura points out, was not so important as what he tried to do, even as that he has left no clear testimony. He had a way of taking people as he found them, and meeting difficulties as they came. Obstacles seemed to cause him less anxiety than the doubts of his followers. In those last years, he had driven whole peoples ahead upon a new path of civilization with such force that they could not return to the old ways. With almost inhuman energy, he had shattered the norms of his time. In so doing, he had set in motion forces too strong to be arrested. It is one of the many paradoxes that surround Alexandros that the depth of his life was not really apparent until after his death. These forces, released by him, left their mark upon human history for a long time. That mark can be seen clearly. The first reaction against Alexandros' embryo world kingdom came naturally enough from his neglected homeland of Macedon. He had died without assuming any definitive title. To most of the Highlanders at home, he had become a despot in Asia, our madman, since Craterus had not arrived in the west. Antipater kept his authority and used his military strength to occupy Greece, which Alexandros had always refused to do. Demosthenes made a last effort for the liberty of Hellas, and fled for safety to Aegina. And perhaps that's why Demosthenes didn't quite so fight, as well, Alexandros Magas is not going to occupy us. But obviously, afterwards, when Macedonian patrols appeared there in search of him, he took refuge within a temple sanctuary and committed suicide rather than be taken captive. What if by committing suicide you don't escape, but you afflict yourself over and over and over again in a guaranteed, constant way? Aristotle was accused of impiety and exiled himself in Chalkis, where he died within a year, thus ending the triumvirate of those dominant minds, Alexandros's, Demosthenes's, and Aristotle's, each of which remained unequaled in its sphere throughout posterity. Oh, everybody's unique in some way, but never again in Greek culture, perhaps. In Greece itself, Alexandros was deified and worshipped as a latter-day Heracles or Apollo, with sacrifices and images and supplication. This was the beginning of the Alexandros cult. Merely ceremonial, it did, however, give evidence of a change that had taken place. To Athenians, Alexandros had ceased to be a Macedonian king. For a space, he had taken from Athens the leadership of ideas. He had opened up new fields of conjecture that bewildered her academicians. So, the Greeks settled the matter by proclaiming him a god and attending the discussions at the academies. Macedon itself had one half of its manpower drained away to the east, or slain, and its feudal aristocracy had been thinned out. The enlightened peasantry refused to return to serfdom under the remaining kinsmen, or the surviving Olympius. This internal dissension was not helped by constant feuds with Asia Minor, which had come under the authority of Antigonus the One-Eyed. Greeks took over the tasks of skilled labor over the army, because an old-style professional affair, depending on an outmoded phalanx. Nothing in all of this served to check the inroads of barbarian Gauls. Later on are the march of the scarcely less barbaric Roman legions 2 centuries afterwards. The successors, when Alexandros died in the palace of Babylon, Ptolemy, Seleucus, Perdiccas, Peucestas, and Nearchus had been there with him. Among the powerful lieutenants, there seemed to be no question as to what to do. The Eurasian state was to be preserved for the descendants of Philip and Alexandros, the 2 heirs being the feeble-minded Archidaus, now a grown man, and the boy who was born to Rushanak. Roxana is what most people are going to call Rushanak. In the months afterwards, for the moment, Perdiccas, a single-minded soldier related to the royal family, was chosen regent. The politic Ptolemy elected to serve as the satrap of Egypt, which he had always craved. Seleucus took upon himself the task of administering the real East from Babylon. Although Alexandros's sarcophagus should have been sent back to Macedon, but Ptolemy managed to take it with him to Egypt, thereby increasing his own prestige. Eventually, he married Thais, who had attached her fortune to his. At Memphis and Alexandria, Ptolemy established his new dynasty. As might be expected, he played the monarch much more than the painstaking Seleucus, who looked on himself as the trustee of the dominion. Concerning these twain, the prophecy of Daniel relates, "And the king of the south shall be strong, but one of his captains shall be stronger and have dominion." Dan All is actually a name we find in the Akkad, or is it Akkad? Something like that. Epic. So, at least 1,000 years before the book of Daniel, we have another book of Daniel. And we kind of have indication that we're talking about the same individual. So, Judaism usurped a tale, or perhaps the tale was in a different position prior, but I mean, it was already probably an old tale and put to different mythological systems because the figure was important. Kind of like an Abraham for some people. You can't look at some random myth about Abraham and say, well, I know about Abraham. Or Abrahamic religion or something. This is not that simple. While Ptolemy occupied himself with building the library at Alexandria, where his half-brother had been interred, Thais played the role of empress at Memphis, becoming the mother of 3 children. No one cared to or dared put on the imperial Iranian robes and tiara that Alexandros had worn. The Diadochi successors, as they came to be known, contented themselves with modified royal dress, with jeweled diadems or headbands, purple cloaks, and red riding boots, vestiges of the Macedonian garments in Asiatic style, which became much later the costume of the Byzantine emperors. Alexandros had shaved smooth, and the successors imitated him, so that in time beards ceased to be worn in the Greek-Roman world, as in opposition to these monotheist religions, which say that men don't shave, or at least they don't shave bare. Well, no, that wasn't in opposition to them, but that sort of behavior is. And in America, they can't. There isn't a job where they can say, "Oh, yeah, you got to shave," or whatever. They'll pay you quite the severance package if they fire you for such reasons, because they're firing you because they hate Christianity, Islam, Zoroastrianism, some form of paganism that calls towards being the natural man, or something to that effect. So stand up for your rights. If that's what you want to do. If you don't want to do that, you shouldn't be forced to either. Alexandros had bequeathed to these successors no clear plan of government. They had only his example and purpose to follow, and this they could not manage to do. Being clean-shaven was well known, and it used to be seen as a symbol of fascism. Even among Christians, they look up only fascist. They accomplished much. However, because, as Olympius had complained so often, they were the equals of kings, they could not manage to keep the military authority separate from the civilian administration, and soon began to rely on the old-style tax collectors. Narkud Seleucus, that benevolent giant, hold intact the far eastern borders. Greek settlers in outer Bactria and Sogd rebelled on hearing of Alexandros' death, as started to march home. The fiefs in India, Seleucus ceded soon after to Chandragupta. Isn't Chandra a type of plant? For a herd of the cherished elephants. Greek became the language of the courts of the successors, replacing the Macedonian dialect as the Koine became the lingo of trade, so that as time went on, the successors tended to become marks of individual states, bound to Greek culture, superimposed over the Asiatics, the Macedonian Iranian fusion that Alexandros had striven for changed imperceptibly into a Greek-Asiatic society, dominating what is known as the Hellenistic world. The companions scattered throughout the new dominion grew to power as nobles in their own right and called themselves friends. They reverted to a professional soldiery, silver shields and all, and served the leader who could pay the best wages. These changes had been unavoidable, perhaps, among men loyal to Alexandros' memory. Real cleavage came out of the civil war caused by Macedon, and especially by the imperious Olympius, who had Archidaus poisoned 6 years after Alexandros' death, leaving Rushenak's son, the only heir. Apparently, she had persuaded the eastern successors to send the Bactrian princess and her boy, the Pella. Perdiccas had not survived, nor had Antipater. What was the name of the yogi or whatever the guy was they picked up in India? I know Antipater was the court soothsayer, but when the conflict between Asia Minor and Macedon grew into open war across the Dardanelles, Cassander, who had trembled at his first sight of a statue of Alexandros, joined the Antigonus family against the Macedonian royal family. Yeah, see, Alexandros was right about his mother. Now, generally, you take your mother's side, but not in where your mother's wrong. So Cassander, son of Antipater, who had been Alexandros' enemy, began to work of destruction of the Macedonians' kindred. In 310 BCE, Cassander was able to capture Olympius, Rushenak, and the 12-year-old boy, Alexandros' son. Even Cassander could not persuade his soldiers to assassinate the now aged Olympius. The men would not use their weapons on the mother, the wife, and the son of the man who was now believed by many of them to have been a god. Cassander himself had Olympius bound and drowned with the 2 others. Now remember that at the end of the last of the 4 characters the 4 historical characters that got put into the Jesus Egregor myth, worked Paul. Paul was in the end of that century. So, but 3 of the Gospels required a good 20 years to go by for people to forget about Apollonius of Tyana, and for there not to be such a living memory of anybody that was a historical person connected to Jesus, or at least not anybody young. This liquidated the last human ties to Philip and Alexandros, leaving the Macedonian commanders free agents, without leaving heirs to the dream of the Empire of Eurasia. Very quickly, 4 years later, Antigonus Gonatas, the weak-kneed, proclaimed himself sole king, and his world law subject to the agreement of the stubborn Macedonian soldiery. Upon this, the world state fragmented through civil war into 4 parts: Macedon, Asia Minor, under the Antigonides, Egypt under the Ptolemies, and Syria to the Hindiku under the Seleucids, with the borderlands fought over at intervals by their armies, and a free Armenia rising in the mountains, with an independent kingdom of the Jews forming in Palestine, the whole joined by a common culture of the Hellenistic world. But this political cleavage and the occasional campaigning of the now professional armies did not arrest an integration that was taking place outside the courts. Now, see, and over a century, you would have what would eventually be called Judaism. You had some starts of it in 540 BCE, but this is a defining factor of what led to the Maccabean revolt and all that. But just as Paul had started a cult, during the last of the figures that he was using for his inspiration of his Jesus, Alexander, the cult was more solidified when those who knew him weren't around. Or, after a generation went by and this fell, then, some of the reference to Alexandros of Macedon is like as if he was a god, that kind of gained some strength in its acceptance, rather than just, it's just something we do. Well, we worship the emperor, that sort of thing. The driving force for, in the Hellenistic world, impulses were at work, which could not be controlled by a new king's law or by military force. In the Greek cities, which remained free, although weak, there was a growing desire for kinship with the outer world, a horror of the old internecine wars. Philosophers had lifted their vision from the polis, or small city, to the greater universe of men. The limited refinement of Epicureans, the enhancement of a selected society preached by the Plato-Aristotle groups, seemed no longer the greatest good. Neither Plato nor Aristotle had given thought to the human beings outside their selected groups. Those beyond the limits of their refinement remained serfs or enemies. Men imbued with a new idea came forward and spoke of it from the Stoa, the porches, and came to be called Stoics. Stoics? I'm not sure how it's spelled in Greek, so we don't know if it's or whether it's the the omega. To them, the individual city, the hearths and shrines of ancient Hellas, mattered not so much as the imagined cosmopolis or world city. What the Stoics put in words, especially their leader Zeno, was much in the thoughts of Greeks after Alexandros' territorial expansion, an imagined Eurasian state, the collapse of the older nations, the mingling of peoples, the use of a universal language, set men to groping for a new fellowship. Into the paths of this mingled humanity were to step the apostles of a new universal religion, Christianity, or at least it would claim to be a universal religion. The tide of migration to the east, started by Alexandros, was running too strong to be checked. The discoveries in the east drew the more adventurous souls from the shores and islands of the Mediterranean toward the gold and the vast farmlands of Asia, as the discovery of the New World after Columbus drew the daring, the discontented, and the religious centers out of Europe in the 16th and 17th centuries. Just like archaeology today, kind of the search for wealth is causing more of a problem than it's solving something. Alexandros' coinage, which now bore his head with lion's mane, as designed by Lysippus, became the standard of the Hellenistic age. At his death, no more than 50,000 talents had remained in the treasury at Ecbatana. He had released the flood of gold that had been locked up by his predecessors of the Persian Empire, this circling freely among soldiers and traders, had put his money into the hands of people as far as the frontier settlements. At the same time, the Asiatics had been losing their lines of racial grouping and had coalesced with the settlers from the West in new centers. We shouldn't be artificially divided into our own boxes of one type of crayon either, so